Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14 as we watch the stars of tomorrow competing in the 2023 college football season. Today we'll be going over weeks 4, 5, and 6. Last episode we kicked off season number 2, going over the first 3 weeks, getting our first look at some of these new teams and players, and there were a lot of exciting games and storylines. So in case you missed that episode, I'll leave a card at the top right of your screen so you can go and check it out. There's already been plenty of movement in the AP Top 25. Notre Dame is currently number 1. Georgia started the year as number 1. They lost in week 2. And then Oklahoma was number 1, and they lost in week 3. So we've already seen 3 different teams with the top spot in the rankings. And then there's plenty of movement and upsets around the rest of the country as well. And I imagine there will be plenty more here through these next 3 weeks. So we are really going to be kicking off conference play in a lot of the major conferences. We're really going to see the Heisman race ramp up. Currently, Bartholomew Blunt is in first place with guys like Isaiah Gordon, Ernie Capillar, and Marco Prince entering the race to start the season. We'll be starting off with week 4, and there are a lot of interesting games on the slate. Alabama, Texas, Penn State, UCF, Pitt, and Oregon. The game I'm most excited about is South Alabama and Michigan, a rematch of the college football semifinal from last year. Week 5, Georgia, Oklahoma, rematch of the SEC title game. Kentucky and Florida, I'm really excited about that game. I think through the first 3 weeks, Kentucky and Florida have been the 2 best teams in the country. And then as we move to week 6, Clemson really gets some tough opponents. They play against Pitt. Plenty of other in-conference matchups around the country as well. So let's start here with week 4 as we open things up with number 15 Rutgers facing off against Memphis. Rutgers is a really good team coming into the ACC. They're led by their star running back, Dr. Antoine, the senior. And I think it's fair to say Dr. certainly stole the show today. Antoine scored 5 touchdowns in this one, helping propel Rutgers to a dominant victory over Memphis. Memphis is a good football team. They won the American Athletic Conference Championship game last year. They won the Fiesta Bowl against West Virginia, but they just got completely slammed on by Dr. Antoine. And Rutgers doesn't necessarily have the most well-rounded roster, but Antoine is the type of player who can carry a team into the 12-team college football playoff. And whenever the ball is in his hands, he is a threat to make a play no matter what. So Rutgers is always going to be dangerous as long as he is on the field. And I especially liked this moment right here. His 5th touchdown of the game. He goes for the Heisman pose. Now, I understand why one might be a little bit skeptical of that, because Dr. Antoine has never been in the Heisman race, well, until now. And after this game, he has moved himself from out of the top 5 all the way to first place. That's pretty incredible. 55-21 your final. Good win for Rutgers, who now sits at number 13 in the college football rankings, entering ACC play. Antoine finished with 259 rushing yards, 65 receiving yards, and 5 all-purpose touchdowns. Truly a performance of the ages, and Antoine is really trying to rise up that draft stock. It's a loaded running back class, and he sits right at the top. Alabama heads down to Texas to take on the Longhorns. Both teams entering this game with 1 loss. And their margin for error gets slimmer if they lose again. In the rain, this ended up being a grinded-out, tough football game, and it ended up being really close. Young quarterback Onyx St. James continues to show flashes for the Longhorns throwing the football. It hasn't been perfect with him, but he has had some good games. Alabama continuing to stick to their motto of running the football. This touchdown by Kyle McCloskey tied the game up at 31, bringing us to overtime. Texas would open OT with a really nice 3rd down conversion called back on a holding, making it a 3rd and long. They just went for a short screen, and it didn't work out. So Alabama's defense gets a stop. Texas would have to kick a pretty long field goal, and they did make the kick, making it a 3-point game. But now Alabama knows all they need is a touchdown to win the game, and Kyle McCloskey, murdering a defender on his way, would waltz into the end zone on the first play of the drive. Roll Tide Roll, Alabama wins it 37-34 in Austin. I think Onyx St. James has shown some good flashes for Texas, but, I mean, he's 1-2. The Longhorns haven't exactly been winning games. Alabama obviously lost their starting quarterback, Bryson Byrne, earlier in the season due to an injury, and they seem to be doing just fine currently without him. Penn State, off to a nice start, heads down to UCF to take on the Knights. Central Florida lost their quarterback to the NFL. Bay Morant picked late by the Denver Broncos. and they ended up going with redshirt freshman Nolan Mitchell II, who has proven to be the real deal. Mitchell has really played well here through these first couple of games for UCF, throwing for scores, running for scores, but unfortunately Mitchell can't play defense, and UCF's defense really struggled. Junior running back Aaron Robinson has totally broken out for the Penn State offense. He looks like one of the best backs in the country right now, and their new starting quarterback, Lyndon Kirkstead, also looks like the real deal, leading Penn State to a come-from-behind victory, 33-28 your final. Penn State was very disappointing last year. They missed out on a bowl game after being projected to win the Big Ten to start the season. This year, they entered with no expectations, and they look really, really good. I think this team could contend for the Big Ten championship if they can keep this up. Lyndon Kirkstead is playing very well, and although Penn State's defense looks suspect, their offense looks phenomenal so far. Oregon facing off against number 13 Pitt. Oregon was also a little bit disappointing last year despite winning the Rose Bowl. I felt like the Ducks could have done more. They didn't really play to their true talent level. So Oregon has a big test today against Pitt this week, and then Michigan next week at the Big House. Pitt has a new starting quarterback of their own, sophomore Warren Bishop, who also looked pretty good today. He threw for some scores, he ran for some scores, but he also cannot play defense, and the Oregon offense is just too talented. Barrett Cherokee, the junior quarterback, continues to be one of the most explosive players in the country. He had a really strong performance in this one for the Ducks, as Oregon would win it 49-28. I guess this is technically an upset because Pitt was ranked right outside of the top 10, and Oregon was unranked to begin with. But I think the Ducks were the more talented team. I think Oregon on paper has one of the 5 or 10 best rosters in college football. So if they can figure things out, unlike last year, this could be a team who really contends for the Big Ten. And I'm very curious to see how they do next week against Michigan. They had a great ground game with Noel Hilaire and obviously Barrett Cherokee. We already talked about how good he is. The Ducks move into the top 25. They are now ranked number 20. Meanwhile, Pitt does not take too much of the nosedive as they fall to number 16. Warren Bishop, 3 passing touchdowns, 118 rushing yards, but he also threw 3 interceptions. Got to do a better job of protecting the football. Air Force was projected to win the Pac-12 after moving in from the Mountain West, and I think these Pac-12 schools kind of have an extra chip on their shoulder trying to prove that just because Air Force won the Mountain West last year doesn't mean they're going to come in and win the Pac-12. And clearly Washington took this personally because the Huskies absolutely dominated this game. Quarterback Keontae Jordan threw for 5 touchdowns, looking to improve his draft stock as Washington would clobber the Air Force Falcons 59-24, your final score. I think the game may have overrated Air Force a little bit at the beginning of the season, and I think the teams that were already in the Pac-12, teams like Washington, Cal, Arizona, teams like that, I think they're going to have a much easier shot of winning the Pac-12 over a school like Air Force, although their freshman quarterback, Keanu Kamialoa, did have some pretty good throws. So it wasn't a total dud of a game for Air Force. Florida has been really strong so far to start the season. They head to Tennessee to face off against their rivals, the Volunteers. Florida should be able to win this game, although it is a rivalry matchup on the road, and Tennessee did keep this game really close. But Florida's just the better team, point blank, period. Elijah Bryant out of the backfield might be the best running back in college football, and he proved why today. Really dominating here for the Florida Gators. Without Bryant, I'm not sure if Florida wins this game, although their young quarterback, Ernie Capellar, is continuing to play pretty good football. Florida would end up winning by the score of 33-24, so the Gators are now 4-0 going into their big matchup next week against Kentucky. As for Tennessee, they are 1-2, not looking great to start the season, and their schedule does not get any easier. Benjamin McKenzie only completed 50% of his passes, so you're certainly hoping to see more from him. And then for Florida, Ernie Capellar, really good. 3 touchdowns, nearly 300 yards. And then Elijah Bryant still doing his thing. He also led the team in receiving as well, as he continues to be one of the best pass-catching backs in the country. LSU's coming off a big win last week against Texas. They are headed to Georgia to face off against the number 8 ranked Georgia Bulldogs. The name to watch for LSU's defense is cornerback Will Johnston, who had an unbelievable day today. Johnston intercepted 3 passes, 2 of which he took for pick sixes. It's funny because last year Georgia's starting quarterback Clyde Williamson threw, I believe, only 2 interceptions in the entirety of the regular season. And today, their starting quarterback, Aaron Ketchikan, threw 2 pick sixes. Ketchikan also threw 5 touchdowns to players who are on his team. So that's 7 touchdowns total, 2 to the defense and 5 to the offense. And, well, considering Georgia's offense was able to get 5 passing touchdowns, you should be able to tell that they scored a lot of points and were able to win the game here over LSU. Also got to shout out Georgia's running back, Keith Humphrey. He's done a great job this season as the backup for Patalomayo Malawalu. Malawalu broke his foot earlier in the season. He should be back later in the year. But Keith Humphrey has done more than a formidable job of replacing him. 49-37, your final good win for Georgia. LSU is such a weird team. They're 1-3. They started the season unranked. They beat a under 500 Texas team, yet they're ranked. I don't really get why LSU's in the top 25, but okay, we'll roll with it. For the Tigers, Thomas Torominko threw 3 interceptions. He certainly still has a lot of improving to do. The flashes are there with him, but he's just got to get consistent. LSU ran the ball at a pretty high level. Justin West was good. Ryan Faison with 2 touchdowns, and then Will Johnston on defense, 3 interceptions, 2 pick sixes. He was fantastic. Got some big-time rivals here facing off in sunny Southern California. UCLA facing off against number 22 USC. The Trojans are off to a tough start this year, mainly because they've played against some really good teams like Oregon and Notre Dame. So I think USC wants to take their aggression out on their rivals, and they certainly did that. The Trojans ran the ball at an unbelievable level today. Senior running back Anthony Raymond is putting himself in Heisman conversations, and freshman Monty Bradley is a really, really good compliment. USC would end up steamrolling the Bruins 49-10. No mercy on their rivals. Scotty Kimbrell II was pretty solid as well, but the story here was the ground game. Raymond and Bradley combining for 260 yards and 5 touchdowns. As for UCLA, they have a freshman at quarterback, Jayshawn Tatum. He's a talented player, but certainly has some improving to do. The game I'm most excited about this week is South Alabama and Michigan. These two teams have some big history. Last year, they played against each other in the college football semifinal, and that game ended up being an instant classic. So this is it. 3rd and 5, 4 seconds to go. If Michigan gets a stop, they win. If South Alabama scores, they win. Brown looking, goes short for Godfrey, and he is in for a touchdown at the buzzer. And South Alabama shocks the world. The Jaguars are going to the national championship. Last season, South Alabama beat Michigan in the college football playoff semifinal to advance to the national championship where they lost to Georgia. I think Michigan has revenge on their minds, and they had no mercy on South Alabama. I was expecting a close game, but this ended up being a blowout. Michigan was pissed after last year's result, and they wanted something to say about that. The Wolverines ended up winning this game 38-3, completely blowing out South Alabama. Bartholomew Blunt and the Wolverines took last year's game personally, and that's going to be a big win here for Michigan, getting some closure on what happened last season, including this unbelievable catch in the end zone by senior wide receiver T.K. Thomas, one of the key players on last year's roster. South Alabama falls to 1-2. They're going to remain in the top 25, but I do have some concerns about South Alabama. They lost all of their key players to the NFL last season, and clearly, I think last year's run looks like a flash in the pan because this South Alabama team looks nothing like they did a year ago. Bartholomew Blunt threw for 5 touchdowns in this game, and then for the Jaguars, Kujay Reddings had a really rough performance. They didn't run the ball. They couldn't play defense. I mean, it was just all bad for South Alabama. Number 4, Ohio State heads back to the shoe to face off against the Missouri Tigers, newly entered into the Big 12. And Ohio State ended up winning this game pretty handedly, 41-21. The Buckeyes are really playing well right now, and I don't know, I just get a different vibe from this Ohio State team this year compared to last year. Last year, they were winning all their games early in the season, but something kind of felt off. And as the season went along, Ohio State proved to be fraudulent. I think this year's team is a lot better. They only had 1 player go in the top 100 of the NFL draft, which shows you with how much talent Ohio State always has, that all their NFL-level players all came back to school. So I think the Buckeyes have a really high ceiling if all goes well for them this season. And this win against Missouri certainly showed that. Although Missouri's quarterback, Latavius Merrington, did have a pretty good day himself, certainly not the reason why they lost. Iowa heads to Minnesota to face off against the 20th ranked Golden Gophers. Iowa is limping into this game. Their starting quarterback and their starting running back both have long-term injuries. QB Cordell Owens tore his hamstring, and running back Choo dislocated his elbow. Those are Iowa's two most important players, and both of those guys were playing really well to start the season. So Iowa's going to need some new faces to step up. Bennett Jones, a redshirt senior, is going to have to lead the way at quarterback, and he did just that. Minnesota should have been able to win this game, but they ended up getting blown out at home to their crippled rivals, 38-19. Really good win here for Iowa to get their season back on track, because if they struggled in this game, then I think things could have really fallen south for the Hawkeyes. Minnesota drops out of the top 25 with the loss. Kane Thompson was Minnesota did run the ball pretty well, but that's really all the extent of it. Bennett Jones had a great game for the Hawkeyes, and then their backup running back, senior Jalen Phillips, with 181 yards and 3 touchdowns. He was really, really good. And then Jackson Seafelt scored 2 of his own. 2-0 North Carolina coming into Tallahassee to take on number 5, 2-0 Florida State. I saw this as a possible upset. I think UNC is a really talented team, but I would very quickly be proven wrong. Florida State was really good last year, and it looks like they are back. Jacob King, the junior quarterback, had some really good throws, including this one to Romani Pierre-Cross for a touchdown. And senior running back Brody Klube is back and better than ever. We're talking about all these great running backs in college football, guys like Elijah Bryant and D.R. Antoine. I think Brody Klube is right there in that conversation as one of the best backs in the country. Florida State wins 45-16, assuring their dominance as one of the best teams in the ACC. UNC, they've got some work to do. I think they are one of the 25 best teams of the country. Graham Fisher missed a lot of throws, but he also averaged over 20 yards at completion. So I think if North Carolina can just get some more consistency within the offense, then they could have a pretty good season. The final game of the day, number 7, Kentucky heads down to Arkansas to face off against the 18th ranked Razorbacks. It's obviously been a roller coaster season so far for Arkansas. They lost their true freshman quarterback in their spring game. Their backup quarterback is only a 69 overall, although Arkansas's defense was really good. Kentucky quarterback Isaiah Gordon did not have his best performance. His only touchdown was to the other team with a pick 6. So Kentucky needed somebody else to step up, and that's going to be freshman running back Fadiala Cisse, who ran for 4 touchdowns, leading Kentucky to the win 32-28, avoiding the possible upset, as Kentucky will come in ranked number 6 going into their big matchup in week 5 against the Florida Gators. Even when Isaiah Gordon doesn't play well, the Wildcats can still win football games. Kader Sissoko did struggle a little bit, although they did have a good performance from their 2 running backs. Gordon wasn't horrible, 65% completion percentage. He made all the easy throws, but we didn't see the big throws that we normally see from him, so they had to depend on Fadiala Cisse, who obviously was great with his 4 touchdowns. As for some of the other games, Miami and Clemson win big. Middle Tennessee with a nice win over Central Michigan. Notre Dame stays at number 1. They beat Purdue. And then going down the board here, West Virginia back on the win column, beating Maryland. Oklahoma back on the win column, beating Ole Miss. Auburn back on the win column, scoring 56 against Ball State. And then some of the other non-ranked games. Mississippi State now 3-0 with a win over Boston College. Good win for the Bulldogs. San Diego State squeaks away from Western Kentucky, 49-42. Army beats Oregon State. Army really struggled in the last episode. We'll see how they do here. Arizona beats Stanford in overtime. Duke beats Baylor by 3. Illinois gets slammed by Tulsa. Wisconsin beats Texas Tech after losing to an FCS team last episode. Louisville wins in a thriller against Temple. Cincinnati beats their rivals Miami of Ohio. Georgia Tech lost to Southern Miss. Now, I completely skipped this when I was scripting out which games I was going to go over for Week 4. We're going to talk about Georgia Tech in Week 5. They play against Clemson, because right now, this season looks rough for Georgia Tech, who is out of the top 25, and things could get worse against Clemson. TCU is 3-0. They beat Vanderbilt. Indiana with a nice win over Northwestern, and that's about it. As we take a look at the top 25 polls, no major movement at the top. The top 5 stays the exact same, and then marginal changes within the top 10. Kentucky and Oklahoma swapped spots. Alabama and Middle Tennessee swapped spots. As for some of the losers this week, Texas only goes down 1. Pitt goes down 3, and then Oregon is now ranked in the top 25, along with UConn. Look out for the University of Connecticut. Could they be a team to really look out for? They have a tough game next week against Missouri, with Georgia Tech and Minnesota both dropping out of the top 25. We already kind of hinted at the Heisman watch. Obviously, Dior Antoine currently in first place. Bartholomew Blount only drops one spot to 2. Ernie Capillar, Isaiah Gordon, and Anthony Raymond round out the top 5, with Kate Hutchinson falling out entirely, which is a surprise because Hutchinson's been playing pretty well so far. Players of the week, Dior Antoine obviously on offense, and then defensively, John Broussard, who had 3 interceptions for Louisville. I feel like it should have been Will Johnston, who had 3 interceptions and 2 pick-sixes. So that brings us to week 5. A couple of really big SEC matchups, Georgia and Oklahoma. Rematch of the SEC Championship and arguably the 2 most talented teams in the country. And then Kentucky and Florida. I think through the first 4 weeks, Kentucky and Florida have been the 2 best teams in college football. So that's going to be a really fun game down in Gainesville. There are plenty of other interesting games as well. Oregon, coming off a nice win against Pitt, has a big test in the Big House against Michigan. South Carolina, Auburn could be pretty fun. LSU, Tennessee could be interesting. And then Georgia Tech, they're looking to rebound after losing 2 straight, going up against Clemson. So let's start at the top here. Number 12, Miami heads to Duke to face off against Duke Blue Devils. Duke has looked pretty solid this year. They were pretty solid last year, and they looked pretty solid today. You know who else was solid in this game? Miami quarterback Scooter Young Jr. Scooter has really taken a leap up from his sophomore season to this year as a junior. He's more efficient as a passer. He's even better as a playmaker on the ground. And speaking of quarterbacks improving, Justin Tucker for Duke has also taken a step up. Tucker would lead Duke to the upset here, 38-35 over Miami. Good win for Duke as they look to compete in the ACC. And I think if the Blue Devils could win some games, they could be not too far behind teams like Clemson and Florida State at the top of the conference. Miami drops to number 18. They are now 2-2. But this was overall a really good game. Really high-level quarterback play. Tucker and Scooter Young both playing very, very well. One team has to win, and ultimately it's going to be Duke. They win their first in-conference game while Miami loses their first in-conference matchup. Penn State is 3-0. They're playing some good football, trying to keep it going here in the desert against Arizona State. The Sun Devils have a really good prospected wide receiver, senior Hector Estrada III, being looked at as a possible first or second round pick, and he looked every part of that first round projection today, hauling in 10 passes, 3 of which went for touchdowns. Penn State's defense did not have an answer for Hector Estrada, but ultimately, Arizona State's defense also did not have an answer for Penn State. There were a lot of points in this game, a lot of high-flying offense, but Penn State's offense was just a little bit too good. The Nittany Lions are completely emerging in front of our own eyes. Lyndon Kirkstead was outstanding in this game, throwing for 6 touchdowns. We need to see Kirkstead really get some Heisman consideration because he has been that good this season. Shai Jones-Porter, Penn State's number 1 receiver, was really good. Chad Johnson, the tight end, was also fantastic. Good win here for Penn State, 59-31 your final. Yes, 59. That is a lot of points. Penn State now all the way up to number 15 in the top 25. Arizona State's quarterback Lucas Harrington was really good as well, and obviously we talked about Estrada, 10 catches, 156 yards, and 3 touchdowns, one of the best games of his young career. But Lyndon Kirkstead really stole the show with his 6 passing touchdowns. He was outstanding, leading Penn State to the victory, and as long as Penn State's offense can continue to play like this, I could see them as a legitimate contender for the college football playoff, which is a very impressive 180 after being at the bottom of the Big Ten last year. Virginia Tech opened up the season, projected to finish dead last in the ACC. But in the intro episode, I told you guys Virginia Tech is going to be a real sleeper in this conference. And through the first couple of weeks, the Hokey Pokeys have proven me right. Sophomore quarterback DeAndre Jones had a nice day against Louisville. Junior wide receiver Rashid Salid is one of the best weapons in the ACC. He had over 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, leading Virginia Tech to the win 45-23. Again, Virginia Tech is really, really good, and I think they could be a team who fights for a bowl game and maybe even fights for a spot in the ACC title game. As for Louisville, their running back had 207 yards. He was really good. Virginia Tech could not stop the ground game, but other than that, it was a really good performance here from the Hokey Pokeys with DeAndre Jones really coming into his own as a sophomore, and of course, Rashid Salid, one of the most talented weapons in the country. Number 8, Georgia heads down to Norman, Oklahoma to face off against the 7th-ranked Sooners. These 2 teams played in the SEC championship game last year, and I think on paper they're the 2 most talented teams in the entire country, although they both have lost a game earlier in the season, so there's a lot at stake in this matchup. Overall, I was impressed with both defenses. Neither passing attack was really able to get anything going consistently. Both passing games did have some big plays here and there, but both offenses really struggled to have consistent drives, and it came down to which team ran the ball better, and ultimately that was the Georgia Bulldogs with Keith Humphrey, the senior running back. And again, reminder, this guy is a backup. He should not be starting. This is supposed to be Patalomayo Malualu's spot, but with his foot injury, Humphrey has come in and he has continued to dominate, leading Georgia to the win 35-19. Oklahoma does not get revenge from the SEC title game last year, although the Sooners only dropped 2 spots. Georgia moves up 2 spots. They are now number 5. Big win for the Bulldogs, big loss for Oklahoma. I still definitely think there's a path for Oklahoma to make the 12-team college football playoff, but their margin for error is a lot slimmer than they would hope for it to be at this stage in the season. Next up, we're going to go to the other big-time SEC matchup. Number 6, Kentucky, facing off against number 9, Florida. 6 versus 9. Nice. As I said earlier, I think these have been the 2 best teams in college football, and both teams definitely looked the part throughout this game. This ended up being a really exciting matchup. Both quarterbacks played very well. Ernie Capellar for Florida has come out of nowhere and has been one of the best quarterbacks in the country. But that's not to take anything away from Isaiah Gordon, who has been equally as good for Kentucky. And Gordon is continuing to look more and more like a first-round pick in next year's upcoming NFL draft. So at this point in the game, it's really close. Kentucky is up by 7, 28-21. Florida has the ball late, and Capellar would drop an absolute dime to Louis Diamatildis in the end zone to tie the game at 28 with about a minute and a half to go, giving Kentucky the ball as they look to move down the field, and their offense is stringing together a few really big plays, positioning themselves in field goal range here with a nice run from Isaiah Gordon. But there's still some time left on the clock, and Kentucky's going to say, who needs a field goal when you can go for 6? Gordon connects with his star receiver, Cassius Morris, in the back of the end zone, leading Kentucky to the win, 35-28. Kentucky jumps all the way up to number 3 in the AP Top 25. Florida moves down to 10. The problem with Florida is that Elijah Bryant only touched the ball 12 times. That's pretty inexcusable. But nonetheless, both quarterbacks played really, really well. Florida State coming off a nice win last week against North Carolina, facing off against Wake Forest. The Demon Deacons don't really have much expectations this year towards the bottom of the ACC, so why not get a crazy upset here? Florida State looked outmatched as soon as this game started. Wake Forest quarterback Jason O'Brien threw for 5 touchdowns, including this dime in the hands of Greg Dortch Jr., and then he had another one shortly after to Boston Griffin to ice the game. Big win here for Wake Forest to really hopefully get some momentum rolling on their season. As for Florida State, again, with the 12-team college football playoff, there's a bigger margin for error, but the Seminoles can't be giving away games like this as Florida State drops all the way down to number 17. They took a big hit in the AP Top 25, and deservedly so, because they did not play well in this game, and they certainly have to rebound after a bad loss against Wake Forest, again allowing 5 touchdown passes to Jason O'Brien, who really put his name on the map. The Missouri Tigers have been one of the most fun and explosive teams in the country as they head to Connecticut to face off against the newly ranked 22 UConn Huskies, who have just entered the top 25, and just as soon as they hop in, they're probably going to hop right out because they could not stop number 15, Latavius Merrington, the senior quarterback. He may be small. He may lack FBS experience, being a graduate transfer from Eastern Washington, but the guy can flat out ball. He's one of the most explosive quarterbacks in the country, making great throws all game, specifically to his number 1 receiver, Tyler Maxwell, who's also being looked at as an NFL draft prospect. Great win for Missouri, 49-16. Clifford Johansson, the young quarterback for UConn, was okay, not great, not bad. But obviously, Merrington was the star of the show. 6 passing touchdowns. He ran for another one. He was outstanding. And as long as he continues to play well, he's another guy who's going to continue to rise his stock up in the NFL draft. Mississippi State is 3-0, led by their high-octane offense, looking to keep it going in Austin against the struggling 1-2 Texas Longhorns, who need a win badly or else their season could fall apart. And, well, their season's not going to fall apart, at least today. Onyx St. James had his best game as a Longhorn, connecting on multiple touchdowns to his top receivers, D'Aiden Washington, and then later a beauty in the corner for Tyrese Barracon, mossing the defender for a score. Onyx St. James even ran for a touchdown as well, leading Texas to a 42-21 victory. However, Mississippi State's quarterback, DeAndre Smith, his draft stock did not go down despite the loss. If anything, it went up as he had another really good game, throwing 3 touchdowns, 2 of which were caught by senior Romeo Gardner, whose stock also goes up today. Overall, a really good performance by Onyx St. James and the Texas offense. They move back up to number 11. As for Mississippi State, they lose their first game of the season despite a really good performance from DeAndre Smith, who continues to be one of the best statistical quarterbacks in the country. Oregon has a big opportunity to prove themselves. After a huge win last week against Pitt, they head to the Big House to face off against number 2, Michigan, coming off a huge win of their own last week against South Alabama. I think Oregon has the talent to match up with Michigan. It's just about consistently playing at that level on a week-to-week basis. The first half of this game was overall pretty close, and Oregon looked like they could hang around with Michigan in terms of talent. I was particularly impressed with both defenses in the first half. Oregon led 10-3 late until this awesome touchdown run by Emmett Denzel to tie the game up at 10 right before halftime. However, Oregon was able to give a quick answer with a great touchdown pass from Barrett Cherokee to Noel Hilaire, giving the Ducks a 7-point lead going into halftime. Going into the third quarter, Michigan would open up with the ball, and Bartholomew Blunt would throw a touchdown on the first play of the quarter, but to the wrong team. The Clawn Daphne would get a pick 6 here from the Ducks, and from there, Oregon would not look back. The Ducks would outscore Michigan 31-7 in the second half, and Oregon would ultimately win in a blowout 51-17. What a huge win for the Oregon Ducks. I told you guys, they can hang with anybody in college football, and they proved it today, blowing out the Wolverines in the Big House in dominant fashion. What a win for the Ducks, who are now 3-1, number 14 in the country. Michigan falls to 8. Bartholomew Blunt did not play well. Certainly not time to hit the panic button for Michigan. Again, there's still plenty of room for, a couple of losses. But still, big win for Oregon, showing that they are a legitimate contender, not just in the Big Ten, but for the college football playoff. Number 21, South Carolina heads down to Auburn to face off against the 19th-ranked Auburn Tigers. The story for Auburn this year has been the play of quarterback Sidney McDonald, who lost all of his top playmakers last year to the NFL, and McDonald has played even better this season, and today he might have had his best game yet. Sidney McDonald absolutely dominated in this matchup for the Tigers. Auburn's offense just completely exploded from start to finish, and they even ran the ball well, too, with a couple of touchdowns from Socrates Doherty. Auburn would end up winning the game 63-31. Yes, 63 points. That is a lot. This Auburn offense is legit, and it's because of their senior quarterback. Marco Prince also played really well for South Carolina. Even in the games that the Gamecocks have lost, Prince has been really impressive. Both Sidney McDonald and Marco Prince have been two of the best quarterbacks in all of college football this season. It's just that the rest of their team has been underwhelming, hence why they're both 2-2. Rutgers is coming off a great win last week. D.R. Antoine obviously had a Heisman-level performance. Can the hype train keep moving for Rutgers as they face off at home against Syracuse? Short answer, no. Syracuse utterly dominated them. This time, the star of the show at running back was not D.R. Antoine, and instead, it was Syracuse's senior back, Afewerk Chike, who ran for 4 scores. Syracuse wins 42-17. D.R. Antoine with a much quieter game, 13 carries, 57 yards. He didn't catch a pass. Syracuse's offense shut him down. Rutgers' defense couldn't stop Chike, leading them to the win. It's been a rough year for Georgia Tech. They're 1-2. And if you remember last year when they played against Clemson, Georgia Tech was kind of just a middling ACC program. They upset Clemson, and they carried that momentum the rest of the year to win the ACC and the Orange Bowl. So Georgia Tech was at the top after beating Clemson last year. And this year, after the Clemson game, I think Georgia Tech has hit rock bottom. Clemson dominated from start to finish in this game. I mean, Georgia Tech looked like an FCS school. I mean, the Yellow Jackets just played horribly today, losing 56-7 against the Clemson Tigers. And although you got to give Clemson a lot of credit because they are a great team and they utterly dominated today, I think this is more indicative on Georgia Tech being a one-year wonder. I mean, the Yellow Jackets just look terrible right now. They've lost 3 games in a row. They're unranked. And, I mean, they just look bad, like, flat out. Georgia Tech is not a good football team. You know who is good? Clemson and Cade Hutchinson. Hutchinson threw for 4 scores. He ran for 2 more. Cade Hutchinson continuing to show why he will be the #1 pick in the upcoming NFL draft. As we take a look at some of the other Week 5 scores, Arkansas barely beats an FCS school. Notre Dame handles Illinois. USC handles Iowa 45-21. West Virginia gets upset by Army. Middle Tennessee State blows out UAB 31-3. TCU is now ranked. They beat SMU. Ohio State dominates Western Michigan. LSU beats Tennessee. And Alabama beats Ole Miss. And then taking a look at some of the other non-top 25 games, Air Force loses again, getting blown out by Stanford. MSU loses to North Texas. Maryland gets killed by Tulsa. Washington State gets killed by UMass. A lot of upsets here, as you can see. Fresno State beats Utah by 7. Minnesota loses again, this time to UCLA. Boise State beats Colorado in a thriller. Boston College beats Texas Tech. Indiana beats Texas A&M. Memphis is 0-3 as they lose to Hawaii in overtime. Nevada upsets BYU. Tulane, who at one point last year was ranked in the top 5, is currently 0-4 as they get blown out by Navy. Baylor barely beats New Mexico. Wisconsin needs overtime to defeat Ball State. Arizona only beats Arkansas State by 7. Washington loses to Buffalo. And then Houston continuing their great start offensively. They beat Western Kentucky 45-31. And then Vanderbilt defeats UCF. Taking a look at the top 25 polls, certainly some movement. Obviously, Michigan dropping down from 2 to 8. Kentucky jumps up to 3. Middle Tennessee State moves up to 7. Notre Dame remains at number 1. Oklahoma only drops by 2. Florida only drops by 1. And then as some of the big movers up, they include Oregon, who goes up 6. Penn State goes up 3. Auburn goes up 3. But Florida State drops down 12. And Miami goes down 6. TCU, the only new team in the top 25, replacing UConn, who just lost to Missouri. Let's take a look at the Heisman race. And through 5 weeks, pure pandemonium. We have another name who has come out kind of out of nowhere, and that is Kane Sanders, who is currently in 2nd place, only trailing Ernie Capellar. So Capellar moves up to number 1 despite losing. And then as for Kane Sanders, I mean, look at the numbers. 18 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 420 yards a game, 74% completion percentage, and his team is 4-0. So I completely get why he is currently a Heisman candidate. Isaiah Gordon in 3rd, Dior Antoine drops to 4, and MJ Hill is now up at 5. So only through 5 weeks, the Heisman race has completely changed. None of those guys were in the preseason race. Things change quickly in college football, and it's not like any of the preseason candidates have been bad. Players of the week on defense, it's cornerback Nate Amazu for TCU. He picked off 3 passes. And on offense, Latavius Marrington. We talked about his great performance in the win over UConn. So as we go to week 6, we've got some fun games. Clemson against Pitt, another big test for the Tigers. Penn State, Nebraska, I think could be a really fun game. Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, some big-time SEC matchups. Big-time Big Ten games as well. Minnesota, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Wisconsin. I'm really excited to see some of these Big 12 teams like Houston and TCU. Are they legit? Let's start with number 2, Clemson, coming into Heinz Field to face off against number 12, Pitt. They lost back in week 4 against Oregon, and the Panthers are trying to reclaim some momentum. But Clemson had other plans. So we know Clemson is led by quarterback Cade Hutchinson, and he was very good once again today. But the story of this game was the run game. Senior running back Kobe Henderson ran for 4 touchdowns, leading Clemson to a blowout win, 49-14. Henderson is quite the story. He was really playing well last year as a junior. He tore his Achilles, and he hasn't gotten off to a great start this year, but he played really well in this game, and I think Henderson is fully back and locked and loaded. You know who's not back? The Pitt offense. They really struggled. Warren Bishop did not have a good game. And Clemson, after beating a really good team like Pitt by a lot and blowing out Georgia Tech, they have moved up to number 1. Number 24, TCU, facing off against Iowa State. TCU is undefeated. They look really, really good. The storyline with them isn't necessarily this game, because Iowa State is really bad, and Iowa State sure played really bad today. But the story is to watch out for TCU. They ran for 7 touchdowns today, 3 of which was by their talented senior quarterback, Sterling Yorkshire. Their 2 running backs, Trevor Taylor and Harry Stewart, both played really well, running for multiple scores. Stewart is the bell cow back, number 2, but Taylor was kind of the star of the show today as TCU wins 63-14. Iowa State's quarterback, Stephen King II, was pretty bad. 84 yards of passing, 3 interceptions. He was not good. Sterling Yorkshire did not throw the ball well for TCU today. It was all about the ground game with Yorkshire running wild along with Taylor and Harry Stewart, and they've got some weapons on offense, and then TCU's defense is also really good. Penn State is a tough test here against 3-0 Nebraska. Nebraska's unranked, but look at their team statistics. They're winning by an average of 30 points, so the Huskers are legitimately a good team. And with this game being on the road, I think this could be a tough matchup for Penn State. And again, the Penn State defense, who hasn't played all that well this year, struggled once again. They had to lean on their offense, and once again, their offense certainly delivered. Lyndon Kirkstead, after throwing 6 touchdowns last week, wasn't as good today. He only threw for 5. Penn State's weapons continued to play great. Number 11, Chad Johnson, here with an unbelievable catch. He has turned into the best tight end in college football. Shea Jones-Porter continuing to be one of the best wide receivers in the country as well. Penn State would end up winning a close one, 42-35. And again, I think the story here is Penn State being really good. I think Nebraska is also really formidable as well, so I wouldn't be concerned that Penn State only won by 1 score. I just think Nebraska is a really tough opponent. Penn State moves up all the way from number 15 to number 7, so clearly the College Football Rankings Committee is hopping on the Penn State hype train, and I think it's time. These guys look like a true contender for the College Football Playoff. Arkansas heads down to Austin to face off against Texas. Both of these teams have multiple losses, trying to get back on the win column. And this game was ugly. It wasn't pretty. Both teams kind of had to play grind it out, tough football, and it ended up going down to the wire. Onyx St. James did not have his best performance, although he did have some really good throws, including this one to Antoine Malone, who caught 10 of St. James' 11 completions today. As for Arkansas, they're of course led by their ground game and junior Cannon McMullen, who was a Heisman contender last year. Hasn't been as good this year, but he has still been really solid. With a big run late here from their quarterback, Kader Sissoko, the Razorbacks took a 3-point lead, 28-25, as Texas would get the ball back one last time, and Onyx St. James would throw up a deep ball, which would be intercepted. St. James was intercepted 3 times in this game, showing off his inner Benedict Sparrow. It's like Benedict Sparrow never left, and he is still the Texas quarterback, because Onyx St. James is like a carbon copy and paste version. So Texas is still ranked, even though they're under 500. Again, Malone was really good, but Dayton Washington 1 catch. Tyrese Barracon 0 catches. That's inexcusable. Those are your 2 best receivers. And funny enough, St. James was arguably better than Arkansas's quarterback, Kader Sissoko, who did run it really well, 119 yards and 2 touchdowns, and only 1 receiver caught it for Arkansas. Number 10, Florida, coming off a tough loss last week against Kentucky, facing off against number 6, Alabama. Both defenses played really well in this game, and early on, it looked like Florida had some more of the momentum. They were up late in the 3rd quarter with a nice touchdown here from Elijah Bryant, who was pretty quiet today. The Alabama run defense was really good. But Florida State led by 11 points going into the 4th quarter, but Alabama's running backs had something to say about that. With 2 late touchdowns from Kyle McCloskey and Quincy Murphy, the Alabama Crimson Tide are going to keep on rolling as they are now 4-1, defeating the Florida Gators 24-21. We might have hopped on the Florida hype train a little bit too early as they've now lost 2 in a row, back down to earth. Troy Davenport did not play well for the Crimson Tide, but McCloskey and Murphy combined for over 300 yards, and those 2 running backs are really the key for Alabama to win. Ernie Capillar, again, wasn't bad. He didn't hurt his Heisman candidacy, in my opinion, but he didn't do enough to help his team win the game either. Houston, just like TCU, is really playing well right now in the Big Ten. The Cougars are 4-0 heading into Kansas State for their first in-conference game against the Kansas State Wildcats. And just like the TCU game, the storyline here isn't necessarily the game itself, but more so, it's time to take Houston seriously. Kane Sanders, who's been unbelievable this season, continued his red-hot start, throwing for over 400 yards and 4 touchdowns once again. Through 5 games, Sanders is averaging well over 420 passing yards a game, 22 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 75% completion percentage. He has been unbelievable. Houston wins 35-21, and the Cougars are now ranked for the first time this season. Kansas State quarterback Bartholomew Buckley had a pretty solid day for the Wildcats, but they do fall to 1-3. Looks like they'll be towards the bottom of the Big 12 again. The Big 12 has been really interesting to follow because I expected teams like UCF and Vanderbilt and West Virginia to be at the top of this conference. But so far this year, it's been Houston and TCU. Those 2 teams play against each other in Week 8, which is going to be in the next episode, and I'm really excited about that matchup. We're going to dive deeper into both of those teams during that Week 8 matchup. Number 4, Ohio State, facing off against the Wisconsin Badgers here early in Big Ten play. As I said earlier today, I think Ohio State's turned a corner from last year. I think they've really improved, but Their offense had other plans today. Ohio State's offense was not good in this game. Marco Burnley really struggled, throwing a bad interception here to Kelechi Green. But as bad as Ohio State's offense was, Wisconsin's might have been even worse. Quarterback Corey Bridges was not good, getting picked off here by Jameer Jefferson, the All-American corner. Ohio State led late, 14-10 in the fourth quarter, but a nice drive and a nice touchdown here from running back Nolan Luke would propel Wisconsin to the upset. 17-14, the Badgers defeat Ohio State, who drops all the way down to number 16. Both offenses played like garbage today. Nobody could throw the ball. Nobody could run the ball. Shout out to the Wisconsin defense for winning their team the game today. They forced turnovers. They forced pressure. Really good performance here from Wisconsin, who started the season off badly. They lost to an FCS school, but the Badgers have won 3 in a row, and they look like they could contend in a loaded Big Ten West. Number 1, Notre Dame facing off against the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Minnesota's been such a weird team this year. They've lost games that they shouldn't. They've won games that they shouldn't. And they're going to try to keep that going today against the Fighting Irish. And Minnesota gave Notre Dame everything they could bargain for. Minnesota ran the ball at a pretty high level. Their quarterback, Kane Thompson, had a really good game. Although the star of the show was Notre Dame's running back, MJ Hill, who has been one of the best players in college football this season. And, Minnesota had no answer for him. MJ Hill ran for 200-plus yards again, continuing to show why he is a legitimate contender for the Heisman Trophy. Although Minnesota couldn't stop him, Notre Dame could not stop Minnesota quarterback Kane Thompson in the fourth quarter. Thompson led a couple of big drives late in the game to make it a one-score game there. And then on this possession here, down by 2, Thompson would throw it for the end zone for the true freshman, Carrie Boyd, who comes down with it. Number 1 Notre Dame loses 38-33 against Minnesota. I think Notre Dame quarterback Baz Boyd had his best game as a starter, ironically enough, despite losing. MJ Hill was great, Jared Richardson was great, but Notre Dame's defense really struggled down the stretch. Kane Thompson throwing for 4 touchdowns. He was fantastic. Minnesota moves up to 20. Notre Dame drops to 9. And then the final game of the day, number 3, Kentucky, looking to keep the good times rolling as they head to South Carolina to face off against the 25th ranked Gamecocks. And sure enough, Kentucky's offense had their way. Isaiah Gordon, coming off a big win against Florida, played maybe even better here against South Carolina, leading Kentucky to their 6th consecutive win. And with Notre Dame losing, Kentucky's able to move up a spot in the rankings as they are now the 2nd-ranked team in the country, only trailing the Clemson Tigers. So Kentucky is now 6-0, South Carolina now under 500, although Marco Prince played well again. Prince has played really well in every game that South Carolina has lost this season, which is kind of funny. Normally, one of those games you'd think the QB would struggle, but no. Isaiah Gordon played well. Shelby, the backup running back, ran through 3 touchdowns. Is Kentucky a fluke, or are they legit? As I look at their schedule, I personally tend to think they are legit. Now, they have allowed at least 28 points in every game, which is not good, but their offense has always outmatched that. They've gotten through the hard part of their schedule already, with a lot of road games and ranked opponents already out of the way. In the final 9 weeks of the season, Kentucky has 3 bye weeks, and they only play 1 ranked opponent, being Georgia. And obviously, that's going to be a really tough game. Georgia's very good. But they get to the easy part of their schedule. I don't think any of these teams are slouches. Tennessee is talented. Mississippi State's good. Vanderbilt, Louisville, pretty solid. Temple's no slouch either. Let's say Kentucky loses to Georgia and loses one of those other games. They still go 10-2 and still position themselves for the college football playoff. So unless they collapse like Tennessee did last year, then Kentucky's probably going to make the playoff. As we take a look at some of the other games, South Alabama gets a rebound win over the University of South Florida, 27-22. Miami back on the win column. They beat Boston College. Georgia handles Tennessee. The Vols now 1-4. Oregon handles Iowa. Duke beats struggling Georgia Tech, who's now 1-4 on the season. Duke now in the top 25. Florida State squeaks away from Maryland. Auburn blows out UTEP. Michigan barely beats Indiana, and Rutgers barely beats Wake Forest. Look at some of the other games. Vanderbilt beats Oklahoma State in a high-scoring matchup. Good win for Southern Miss over Troy. Syracuse is playing some good football, as is the 4-0 Virginia Tech Hokey Pokies. I told you about Virginia Tech. They are legit. UCF blows out Kansas. BYU beats Texas Tech. West Virginia loses again, this time to UCLA. The Mountaineers now under 500. Tulsa blows out 0-5 Western Kentucky. Memphis finally wins, beating UConn. Arizona with a nice win. They're still undefeated. Cal with a nice win. And then going down even further, Arizona State with a good win over Utah. and that's really about it. So as we take a look at the new rankings, we're certainly going to see some big-time movement with Ohio State, Florida, and Notre Dame all losing. So Clemson is the new number 1 team. We've now had 4 different teams ranked number 1, and we're only in week 7. College football is weird. Kentucky is now 2, Middle Tennessee State is now 3. We haven't really talked about Middle Tennessee State too much this year, which I guess in their case is kind of the good thing. But their schedule does get tougher, so we'll highlight them in the next episode. Notre Dame goes down 8, Ohio State goes down 12. Minnesota, Houston, and Duke are now ranked, with LSU, West Virginia, and South Carolina dropping out. As we take a look at the Heisman race, we have a new face in first place. Keith Humphrey, the backup running back. Again, let me remind you, he is a backup. Patalomayo Malawalu's injury might have been a blessing in disguise for Keith Humphrey, who was not a Heisman contender going into the week, and now he's in first place. Sidney McDonald and Lyndon Kirkstead are new to the list. Kane Sanders stays at 2. Isaiah Gordon goes down to 4. So the Heisman race all year has just been completely drunk. Players of the week, linebacker Matthew Smiley for Syracuse, and Virginia Tech quarterback DeAndre Jones. Again, I told you about the hokey pokeys. So before we end the episode, we're going to play a game. Stock up, stock down, and who to watch out for. We're going to look at teams who improved in my eyes today, went down in my eyes today, and teams to watch out for in the future. Despite losing their starting quarterback to an injury, Alabama played really well, and the Crimson Tide looked like they could contend for a national title. And then Auburn really impressed me as well. Sidney McDonald is on fire right now. Clemson's been playing outstanding football. They are deservedly number 1. Houston is looking really good. Kane Sanders has been maybe the best player in the country. Kentucky has proven themselves to be legit. They look like a real national contender. Oregon with a couple big wins today over Pitt and Michigan. They look like a real contender. Penn State is legit. They are 5-0, now ranked in the top 10. TCU, again with Houston. I'm excited to highlight them more in the next episode. And then stock down. It's easy to talk about the teams who lost for the first time today, like Florida, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, Florida State. But those teams all have a shot still at the championship. I want to focus on teams whose stocks really went down today. I don't think there's a bigger loser today than Georgia Tech, who went 0-3. They got blown out by Clemson. Georgia Tech's a bad football team, flat out. And this is coming off last year where they won their conference and the Orange Bowl. Minnesota's kind of weird because I feel like they've underperformed, but they also just beat Notre Dame. Pitt, they lost some games today. I think they were overranked, just like last year, albeit the teams they lost to today are really good. South Alabama, they're not a national title contender like they were last year. South Carolina is an interesting one because I don't think they're a bad team. They just aren't really winning games. Tennessee does look bad right now, and it's weird because last year at this spot, they were one of the 5 best teams in the country, and now they're 1-4 and in danger of not making a bowl game. Texas is another interesting one. They're under 500 right now. Last year they were disappointing. This year they look disappointing again. And then UCF, Vanderbilt, and West Virginia, all in the Big 12. I expected more out of all 3 of them, and they've all been pretty mediocre. Then some teams to watch out for. I think Arizona's a real sleeper. Really, a lot of those teams in the Pac-12. And then Middle Tennessee State, of course, we're going to highlight them more in the next episode. They're playing really well. They just haven't played anyone good. And then Wisconsin. After losing to an FCS team, they've won 3 in a row. They just beat Ohio State. So watch out for Wisconsin. They could be an interesting sleeper going forward. Next episode, we've got weeks 7, 8, and 9. Week 7, we've got some interesting games, including the Red River rivalry. Texas is looking for revenge after losing by 50 to Oklahoma last year. Week 8, we've got some really fun games. TCU Houston, I'm very excited about. I'm really curious to see which one of those teams proves to be more legit. And then going down the board, Ohio State and Michigan. Why do they play against each other in week 8? I don't know, but that's going to be a really fun game. And then week 9 as well, some very interesting matchups too. So that's going to wrap up the episode. I hope everyone enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new and are excited for more NCAA Next Up content. Peace out.